Jonathan Ellison was the kind of man people in Houston, Texas called perfect. At 42, he seemed to have it all. A thriving OB-GYN practice, a waiting list of patients eager to see him, magazine features praising him as one of the best doctors in the South. At medical conferences and charity galas, Jonathan was always the man in the tailored suit, smiling with quiet confidence, carrying the aura of someone who knew he was at the very top. Colleagues admired him, patients trusted him, and the community held him up as a shining example. His marriage to Marissa Rivera only sealed that image. Marissa was young, radiant, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a single smile. Standing beside Jonathan, she looked like the missing piece to his already perfect picture, the successful doctor with a beautiful bride. On their wedding day, local newspapers ran features about the fairy tale couple, and social media lit up with photos of Jonathan in a tuxedo holding Marissa's hand as she glowed in her white gown. Friends whispered, "It's like something out of a movie." At the reception, Jonathan raised his glass of champagne with the ease of a man who had everything under control. He introduced Marissa proudly, calling her the gift I never thought I deserved. She smiled softly, a little shy, clutching his hand as though anchoring herself in his presence. To the guests, it was pure magic. After the honeymoon, they settled into a lavish home in River Oaks, one of Houston's most exclusive neighborhoods. Jonathan filled the place with European furniture and expensive modern art. He even turned one of the spare rooms into a private reading lounge for Marissa. Neighbors watched with envy when Jonathan pulled up with a brand new Maserati, a wedding gift for his bride. To everyone else, this was the dream marriage, success, wealth, and young love rolled into one. But behind the polished facade, subtle cracks began to show. Marissa kept to herself, rarely mingling with neighbors or inviting anyone over. On their wedding day, her side of the family had been noticeably absent, save for a distant aunt Jonathan had never met before. Some whispered about it, but Jonathan brushed it off. He told himself she must have had a lonely childhood, nothing more. The first few months of marriage passed in a blur of busy schedules. Jonathan spent long hours at the clinic, often flying to conferences across the country. At night, he'd come home to Marissa waiting with a glass of wine and a gentle smile. To the outside world, it looked picture perfect. Still, Jonathan felt the emptiness. Each time he tried to be intimate, Marissa pulled away. Headaches, fatigue, vague excuses, she always had a reason. As a gynecologist, Jonathan was no stranger to the details of women's health. He noticed things most men wouldn't. No sign of menstrual cycles, no purchases of feminine products, no conversations about anything related to her body. But he forced himself to believe her excuses. She just needs time, he thought. Late at night, alone in his study with a glass of whiskey in hand, Jonathan would replay his life. By all accounts, he was living the dream: money, reputation, a stunning wife. Yet the silence of the big house weighed on him. Marissa never let him close, truly close. And for a man who built his career on understanding women's bodies, her distance gnawed at him like a quiet, unspoken insult. In public, Jonathan kept up appearances. At cocktail parties, he told stories about his wife's passion for rare books or the way she cared for the roses in their backyard. To his friends, he looked like a man blissfully married. Image meant everything in his world, and Jonathan made sure no one saw the faint shadow creeping in behind his smile. Marissa, to outsiders, was the picture of grace, polite, delicate, always smiling when standing next to her husband. But when Jonathan caught her alone, there were moments when her eyes drifted away, full of something he couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or a secret too heavy to share. Jonathan told himself every marriage carried its mysteries. With time, he believed they would work through theirs. To him, the cracks were just temporary flaws in an otherwise perfect life. What he couldn't know was that this flawless image, the perfect man, the perfect wife, the perfect life, was only a mask. And the truth hiding beneath it would one day shatter everything, turning his fairy tale marriage into one of the most shocking crimes the nation had ever seen. The first months of marriage slid by in a haze of polished smiles and carefully kept routines, but beneath the surface, Jonathan Ellison began to sense something he couldn't quite name. At first, it was small things, details easy to dismiss. Marissa never changed sheets herself, always insisting on hiring a cleaner, even though Jonathan had offered to help. She kept the bathroom door locked, even when she was just brushing her teeth. She'd slip away in the middle of the night and return only after he drifted back to sleep. For any other man, these quirks might have been passed off as shyness. For Jonathan, whose career revolved around noticing what others overlooked, they became puzzles he couldn't stop turning over in his mind. Jonathan prided himself on being a man who saw through people. In his practice, he could predict what a patient would say before she said it. He understood body language, evasions, the nervous laugh that hid embarrassment. Yet with Marissa, his own wife, he felt stonewalled. The more he tried to reach her, the more elusive she became. She kept a smile ready at dinner parties, listened attentively when he spoke about his work, but when night fell and it was time for them to share the most basic intimacy, she pulled back. "It's not you, Jonathan. I'm not ready," she whispered once, curling into herself under the covers. Not ready. The words echoed in his mind long after she had fallen asleep. How could a wife not be ready months into a marriage? Jonathan told himself to be patient, to respect her boundaries, but with every rejection, his pride took another cut. The evidence mounted in ways too obvious for him to ignore. He had never once seen a tampon box in the trash or a sanitary pad tucked away in her purse. As a doctor, Jonathan knew the female body inside and out. The absence of these small signs gnawed at him. It wasn't just unusual, it was unnatural. One evening, when Marissa excused herself to take a long bath, Jonathan poured himself a scotch and sat in his study. His gaze fell on the leather briefcase where he kept important documents, and without thinking, his mind flicked to Marissa's files. Early in their relationship, she'd told him she had no significant medical history. No allergies, no surgeries, nothing to worry about. At the time, he had been too infatuated to press further. Now, that claim burned in his thoughts. The next day, while Marissa went shopping, Jonathan searched their home office. He expected to find insurance records, vaccination forms, something, anything. But the file folders neatly labeled with his name and his patients were untouched. Marissa's drawer was practically empty. There was no trail, no past, no evidence that she had ever seen a doctor for anything in her entire life. For a woman in her 20s, that was more than unusual. It was suspicious. Then came a night that changed suspicion into certainty. Jonathan had been called back to the clinic after hours for an emergency delivery. When he returned home close to dawn, he found Marissa asleep on the couch, her purse left open on the coffee table. Inside, among the lipstick and perfume, was a small orange prescription bottle. He picked it up, his eyes narrowing at the label. Estradiol. His stomach dropped. Estrogen pills. Jonathan set the bottle back and sat there, staring at her as she slept. The puzzle pieces slammed together in his mind, forming a picture he refused to believe. Hormone therapy, empty medical files, the avoidance, the distance. He poured himself a drink, hands trembling as he tried to convince himself there was another explanation. But he was a doctor. He knew there wasn't. From that day on, Jonathan saw Marissa differently. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, he dissected with surgical precision. He began testing her in subtle ways, asking questions about her childhood, about family she never mentioned. The answers came out vague, rehearsed, like she'd practiced them 100 times before. His unease curdled into resentment. At the clinic, Jonathan still played the role of the compassionate physician, the man who listened without judgment. But at home, when Marissa leaned in to kiss him, he stiffened. When she laughed at a joke, he heard something hollow beneath the sound. She was hiding something that, if revealed, could destroy not only his marriage, but the image he had spent decades crafting. The shame of it all consumed him most at night. Lying beside her, he felt like a stranger in his own bed. For a man whose reputation rested on being an expert in the female body, the idea that his own wife might not be what she seemed felt like a cruel cosmic joke. He pictured the whispers if the truth ever came out. Jonathan Ellison, the OB-GYN who couldn't even tell the difference in his own home. One evening, he came home early to find Marissa standing by the bedroom mirror, adjusting the strap of her dress. She flinched when she noticed him, quickly pulling the fabric over her shoulder. Jonathan caught the movement, the quickness, the panic in her eyes. That single moment convinced him he couldn't ignore it anymore. Over dinner, his words came sharper than intended. "Marissa, why don't you ever talk about your family? Why don't you ever let me see all of you?" Her fork froze midair. "Jonathan, please, can we not do this?" He leaned closer, voice low. "I'm your husband. I deserve to know the truth." Marissa's hands shook as she put down her fork. "You have all of me," she whispered, though her eyes darted away. That night, Jonathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Marissa's steady breathing filled the room. He knew he had reached the end of his patience. Whatever she was hiding, he had to uncover it himself. He told himself it was about love, about honesty, but deep down he knew the truth. It was about pride. It was about not being the fool. And so, in the quiet corners of his mind, a plan began to take shape. If Marissa wouldn't open up, he would force the truth into the light. He was a doctor. He had the tools, the knowledge, and the access. All he needed was the right moment. Jonathan Ellison, the perfect husband and celebrated physician, had just crossed the invisible line between curiosity and obsession. And the obsession would soon lead him, and Marissa, into a night that neither of them would survive. It was close to midnight when Jonathan finally decided he couldn't endure the gnawing doubt anymore. The house in River Oaks was silent, the city outside their gates a faint hum. He stood in the hallway, staring at the closed bedroom door where Marissa had just turned off the light. She believed the conversation was over for the night, that her vague reassurances would be enough to quiet him down, but Jonathan knew he couldn't live in the dark another day. He walked to his study, poured a stiff bourbon, and tried to steady his nerves. His mind spun with clinical certainty, patterns he'd seen in patients, signs he'd ignored in his own home. He could no longer push them aside. If Marissa wouldn't answer his questions, he would do what he had been trained to do: examine, uncover, find the truth. "Marissa," he called softly, stepping into the bedroom. She stirred, blinking at him with sleepy confusion. "What is it?" she murmured, her voice groggy. "You haven't had a proper physical since we married," Jonathan said, his tone carefully controlled. "I've been negligent as a husband, as a doctor. Come with me to the clinic. Tonight, I need to be sure you're okay." Her eyes widened. "Now?" "Jonathan, it's midnight." He forced a gentle smile. "I just want peace of mind. Please." Something in his voice must have unnerved her, because after a long pause, she agreed. She slipped a sweater over her nightgown, and together they drove through the quiet Houston streets to his private practice. The building loomed cold and sterile under the glow of the parking lot lights. Inside, Jonathan flicked on the fluorescents. The sharp buzz filled the silence as he guided her toward an exam room. He helped her onto the table with the same professional precision he used with patients every day. But tonight, the dynamic was different. This wasn't a patient. This was his wife, the woman who had promised him honesty, the woman who had somehow managed to slip through every net of his expertise. Marissa shifted uneasily on the paper-lined table. "Jonathan, this feels strange. Can't this wait until morning?" He shook his head, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. "No, it can't." For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with a gnawing suspicion inside his chest. He reached for the exam lamp and swung it into place, its circle of light falling over her body like an interrogation spotlight. "Jonathan," Marissa's voice cracked, soft pleading. "Please," he said, more to himself than to her. "I need to know." He moved with a doctor's efficiency, but inside, his pulse hammered. As his hands worked, the truth revealed itself with devastating clarity. His suspicions weren't paranoia, they were fact. Marissa's body was not what she had claimed it to be. Where he expected to find the anatomy of a woman, there was none. Instead, there was what his medical training identified instantly: male genitalia, not surgically removed, only hidden, disguised beneath layers of clothing and silence. Jonathan staggered back, as though struck. His gloves trembled, his breath came shallow. His eyes locked on Marissa's face. She burst into tears. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered, her hands covering her face. "I was going to so many times, but I couldn't. I couldn't risk losing you." Her words barely registered. Jonathan felt the room tilt, as if gravity itself had betrayed him. A cascade of memories rushed back. The compliments from colleagues about his perfect life, the patients who envied his marriage, the way he had built his entire identity on being the man who understood women best. And now, in the sterile brightness of his own clinic, that identity was crumbling. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "All this time. You lied to me, to everyone." Marissa shook her head frantically. "I never wanted to hurt you. I want to be loved as me. As Marissa, not Michael. I've been transitioning for years. I thought if I could just make it through." Her words dissolved into sobs. Jonathan's chest burned with humiliation. He imagined the headlines if this ever leaked. OB-GYN fooled by his own wife. The whispers at medical conferences, the snide remarks behind his back. He had built his reputation on certainty, on mastery. And here was the cruel irony. His own wife had kept from him the very truth he prided himself on always uncovering. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Marissa reached out a trembling hand. "Please, Jonathan, I love you. I'm still me." But Jonathan didn't see the woman he'd married. He saw betrayal carved into her features. His breathing grew ragged, and he tore off his gloves, flinging them to the floor. "You made me a fool," he hissed. Marissa flinched as though the words were a blow. No, I never wanted that." Jonathan's eyes darted around the room, landing on the cold steel instruments gleaming under the lamp. His mind raced with images of his career collapsing, his colleagues laughing, his patients turning away. Shame fused with rage until he no longer knew where one ended and the other began. In that blinding rush of fury, Jonathan stepped forward, his hands closing around Marissa's throat. Her eyes went wide, her fingers clawing at his wrists. She gasped for air, choking out his name, but he pressed harder, driven by something darker than reason. The sound of paper crinkling beneath her body mixed with the harsh fluorescent hum, until suddenly there was silence. Utter, absolute silence. Jonathan stood there, trembling, staring down at the still form of the woman who had once been his salvation and was now his ruin. His chest heaved. The reality of what he had done began to seep into him like ice water. For a long time, he didn't move. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he let go, stumbling back against the counter, his hands shaking violently. He told himself it was an accident, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far. But the truth lay heavy in the room. Jonathan Ellison, the perfect husband, the perfect doctor, had just crossed the line into something irredeemable. And the cameras mounted in the corners of the clinic had caught everything. Jonathan stood frozen in the exam room, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the silence where Marissa's gasps had been only moments before. His chest heaved with ragged breaths, sweat trickled down his temples, and his hands, those hands that had delivered hundreds of babies, soothed frightened mothers, and symbolized healing, were now instruments of death. He could feel the latex gloves sticking to his damp skin, a grotesque reminder of what he had done. Marissa's body lay twisted on the crinkled exam paper, her eyes half open, tears still glistening on her cheeks. Her lips were parted, as though she had tried to form one last plea. For a moment, Jonathan saw not a deceiver, not a threat to his reputation, but the young woman who had smiled shyly at him on their first date, who had held his hand at their wedding, who had whispered promises of forever. The weight of what had just happened crashed over him like a wave. He staggered back against the counter, gripping its edge to steady himself. "No," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if denial could undo the past few minutes. No. And then, something impossible happened. A sound, faint and broken, rose from the table. Marissa's chest lifted slightly, a shallow breath rattling in her throat. Her eyes fluttered, and with a weak, trembling voice, she whispered, "Jonathan." He froze. She wasn't gone. Not yet. Jonathan rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "Marissa, Jesus Christ, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean," his words tumbled out, desperate, unsteady. Her gaze locked on him, glassy with pain, but still pleading. "I wanted to tell you. I was so scared. You were everything to me." Tears streaked down her cheeks again. "I just wanted to be loved." The confession pierced through Jonathan's fury like a scalpel. He had imagined betrayal, humiliation, a deliberate deceit meant to mock him. But now, hearing the rawness in her voice, he saw something different. Fear, vulnerability, and above all, longing. She had not tried to destroy him. She had tried to hold on to him, even if it meant hiding the part of herself she feared would drive him away. Jonathan pressed a trembling hand to her cheek, torn between guilt and anger. "Why, Marissa? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" Her lips quivered, and she let out a shaky breath. "Because I trusted you too much. I thought if I lost you, I'd lose everything." Her hand, weak and unsteady, lifted toward him. "I never lied about loving you. Not once." The words lodged in Jonathan's throat, choking him. His mind raced back to all the moments he had questioned her, the locked doors, the excuses, the missing records. Each time, she hadn't been mocking him. She had been protecting herself, terrified of the rejection she was certain would come. Jonathan's eyes burned, hot tears threatening to spill. He was the one who had promised to cherish and protect her, and here he was, kneeling beside the woman he had nearly killed because his pride had been wounded. For the first time in his life, the man who always held control, who always knew the answers, felt utterly powerless. "I could have accepted it," he whispered hoarsely, though deep down he wasn't sure if that was true. "Maybe I could have. I don't know." But now, his voice broke, trailing into silence. Her hand slipped from his, falling limp to the table. Her eyes closed, her breath shallow and fading. Jonathan pressed 2 fingers to her neck. There was a faint pulse, fragile as a candle about to go out. Relief surged through him, quickly chased by terror. He looked up at the security camera in the corner of the room. The little red light blinked steadily. Everything, the confrontation, the revelation, the violence, was recorded. There would be no hiding from the truth. Jonathan buried his face in his hands. He wanted to scream, to tear the camera from the wall, to erase what had just happened. But no amount of power, wealth, or reputation could rewrite the last hour. He heard his own voice crack as he whispered, "God, what have I done?" The sound of her shallow breaths filled the room again, fragile and fleeting. He leaned over her, clutching her hand, as though his touch alone could keep her tethered to life. "I don't care about the cameras, about the world out there," he said, voice breaking with each word. "Just don't leave me like this. Don't let the last thing you remember of me be this." Tears spilled freely now, streaking down his face. The man who had once been untouchable, who had built his life on control and composure, was reduced to sobs in a sterile exam room, begging the wife he had tried to destroy for forgiveness. Marissa's eyelids flickered again, her voice barely audible. "It's not too late," she whispered, though he didn't know if she meant for him or for herself. Jonathan bent over her, pressing his forehead to hers. For the first time since their wedding day, there were no pretenses between them, no carefully crafted illusions. Only truth, raw and merciless. And though he didn't yet realize it, that tearful confession, the words Marissa managed to gasp out before the darkness took her again, would echo far beyond this room. It would become the center of the investigation, the spark that ignited a trial dividing an entire nation. But in that moment, Jonathan wasn't thinking about trials or headlines or reputations. He was thinking only of the fragile life slipping through his hands, and the haunting truth that he, the man who was supposed to heal, had become the one who broke her. Jonathan sat hunched on the rolling stool in the exam room, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. He could still hear the faint rasp of Marissa's breathing, shallow and broken, each exhale weaker than the last. For a fleeting moment, he thought there might be a way forward. If she survived her final breaths, if there was still a chance for words, for forgiveness, for something other than this unbearable silence. But then his gaze lifted, landing on the blinking red light of the security camera, steady and unrelenting, recording everything. Whatever hope flickered in him guttered out in that instant. That light was not just a camera, it was a witness. A silent jury that had already condemned him. Every second of his violence, every word spoken, every truth unveiled, all recorded. And Jonathan knew what that meant. He saw the headlines already forming. Celebrated OB-GYN murders wife after discovering she was transgender. His career, his reputation, his entire identity would be obliterated. He would become the punchline of a cruel joke, the fallen man who couldn't even see the truth in his own marriage. Marissa stirred weakly on the table, her shallow breaths rattling. Her eyes flickered open, cloudy with pain, but still holding that same pleading vulnerability. "Jonathan," she whispered, voice faint, "please don't let this be the end of us." Something twisted deep inside him. For the briefest instant, he wanted to collapse in her arms, to beg for the forgiveness she was somehow still willing to give. But instead, shame surged like acid through his veins, burning away any softness. Shame and fear. He pictured the courtroom, prosecutors tearing apart his life, colleagues shaking their heads in disgust, the public jeering his downfall. All because of the woman lying before him. Because of the secret she had carried, the truth she had hidden. "You ruined me," he hissed, the words spilling out like venom. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Her lips trembled. "I never meant to. I loved you. Love me." His voice cracked into a bitter laugh. "You deceived me. You made me a fool in front of the whole world." Marissa's tears streamed down her cheeks. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I told you, you'd never even give me a chance." Jonathan's fists clenched. In another life, maybe those words would have pierced his armor. But here, in this cold room with the camera recording every second, he saw only one path forward, and it was drenched in blood. He stood suddenly, the stool screeching backward across the tile. The sharp noise made Marissa flinch, her fragile body curling in instinctive fear. Jonathan's breath came fast and shallow, his face contorted in a mask of rage and desperation. "Do you know what people will say about me?" he shouted, slamming his fist on the counter so hard the instruments rattled. Jonathan Ellison, the great OB-GYN, couldn't even tell that his wife was a man. "They'll laugh. They'll destroy me." Marissa shook her head, sobbing. "No, please, we can fix this. We can leave, start over. Start over." His voice dropped, trembling with fury. "There's no starting over. There's only ruin." He lunged at her then, his hands once again wrapping around her throat. She gasped, her nails clawing weakly at his wrists. This time, there was no hesitation, no chance for mercy. His grip tightened, fueled by a storm of rage, humiliation, and the cold calculation of a man who saw no other escape. Marissa's eyes widened in terror, her body writhing against the paper-covered table. The sound of her choking breaths filled the room, mingling with Jonathan's own ragged gasps. Her tears slid down his fingers as he pressed harder, shutting out her desperate pleas. "Jonathan," she croaked one last time, her voice breaking, and then it was gone. Her body convulsed once, then went limp beneath him. He held on for a long moment after the fight had left her, as though making absolutely sure there would be no return. When he finally released his grip, her head lolled to the side, her lifeless eyes staring at the harsh fluorescent light above. Jonathan staggered back, chest heaving, his hands trembling. He stared at her body, at the stillness that now filled the room, and for a fleeting second, he felt something like relief. The truth, the threat, the unbearable shame, snuffed out. But the relief quickly curdled into dread. The camera still blinked. The evidence was still there. And now, there was a corpse on his exam table. He rushed to the sink, scrubbing his hands under scalding water, trying to erase the sensation of her skin, of her last breaths beneath his fingers. But nothing could wash away what he had done. Turning back to the body, his doctor's instincts fought with his panic. He examined her neck, noting the telltale bruises that would betray the truth. He thought of the coroners, the detectives, the autopsy. He had delivered thousands of diagnoses in his life, but now the only diagnosis that mattered was his own: murder. No one can know, he whispered to himself, pacing the room. It has to look like something else. His gaze darted across the instruments, the exam table, the cabinets of medication. Ideas churned in his frantic mind. A medical emergency, a complication, an accident, anything but the truth. Jonathan Ellison, the healer, the respected doctor, had just become a killer. And as he stood in that room, staring down at the lifeless woman he once called his wife, he knew the nightmare was only beginning. The next morning, the body of Marissa Rivera lay cold in the exam room, draped hastily with a sheet Jonathan had pulled from a supply closet. He hadn't slept. He had spent hours pacing, scrubbing his hands until the skin turned raw, and drafting half-formed plans in his mind. Finally, just before dawn, he decided on his story. Marissa had collapsed during a routine checkup. A tragic medical emergency. Cardiac arrest, maybe. Something sudden, something plausible. He would be the grieving husband who had tried and failed to save his wife. Jonathan staged the scene with the precision of a surgeon. He carefully removed the gloves he'd worn, disposing of them in a biohazard bin. He rearranged the instruments, placed a stethoscope around his neck, and splashed cold water on his face to mimic the frantic sheen of sweat. Then he dialed 911, forcing his voice into a panicked tremor. "My wife, she collapsed in my office. I think it was her heart. Please hurry." The paramedics arrived within minutes. Jonathan met them at the door, his expression etched with anguish. He guided them to the exam room, explaining that Marissa had suddenly gone into distress during a routine evaluation. They rushed to check her vitals, but within seconds one of the EMTs shook his head. "She's gone," he said quietly. Jonathan slumped against the wall, pressing his face into his hands. The performance was convincing, even to himself. But paramedics weren't detectives, and detectives were coming. By mid-morning, Houston PD officers arrived. They were polite, professional, but Jonathan could sense the suspicion in their measured glances. Any unexpected death in a medical office, especially of someone so young, demanded questions. Detective Carla Monroe led the inquiry, a sharp-eyed woman with a calm, deliberate manner. She asked Jonathan to walk her through the night. He recited his rehearsed lines. Marissa had complained of dizziness. He insisted she undergo a quick checkup. Halfway through, she collapsed. He tried resuscitation, but it was too late. His voice cracked at the right moments. His eyes reddened from real exhaustion and forced tears. But Monroe's gaze lingered on him longer than he liked. "Dr. Ellison," she said evenly, "do you mind if we pull the security footage from your office? Just procedure." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He had forgotten the cameras. He masked his panic with a practiced sigh. "Of course. Anything you need." While technicians extracted the recordings, the medical examiner arrived to transport Marissa's body. Jonathan forced himself to look grief-stricken, hovering nearby, but never too close. Inside, though, dread coiled tighter with every passing second. That evening, Detective Monroe called him back to the station. She didn't waste time. She pressed a button, and grainy black and white footage filled the screen. There he was, Jonathan Ellison, the respected OB-GYN, towering over Marissa, his hands clamped around her throat. Her struggles, her collapse, every detail laid bare. Jonathan's stomach dropped. His mouth went dry. Monroe leaned forward, her voice steady but heavy with accusation. "Do you want to explain this, doctor?" He stammered, searching for words. She attacked me. I was defending myself. She was hiding things from me, lying." His voice grew frantic, desperate. "You don't understand. She wasn't who she said she was. My entire marriage, my life, it was built on a lie." The words hung in the air, venomous and damning. Monroe's expression hardened. "Her identity doesn't change what you did. It doesn't justify this." Within hours, Jonathan was booked, photographed, and charged with second-degree murder. The news spread like wildfire. By dawn the next day, headlines screamed across every platform. OB-GYN kills wife after discovering she was transgender. The media swarmed outside the police station. Microphones thrust toward every official. Commentators dissected the case on national broadcasts. Some painted Jonathan as a betrayed husband who snapped under deception. Others called it a hate crime, fueled by prejudice and pride. At the hospital where he had once been revered, staff whispered in shock. Patients canceled appointments. His nameplate was removed from the clinic door. Years of respect and accomplishment vanished overnight, replaced by scorn and outrage. Meanwhile, the autopsy confirmed what the cameras had already revealed. Marissa had died from manual strangulation. The bruising on her neck, the burst blood vessels in her eyes, textbook signs of homicide. There was no medical mystery, no hidden condition, no way out. Detective Monroe compiled the evidence. The footage, the autopsy, the hormone prescriptions found in Marissa's purse. Piece by piece, the narrative came together. Jonathan Ellison hadn't lost his wife to tragedy. He had killed her in rage. In the days that followed, Jonathan sat in a jail cell, stripped of his tailored suits and polished reputation. He replayed the events over and over, searching for a version where he could still be the victim, where the world would understand his humiliation. But the evidence was undeniable. The cameras had captured not just a crime, but the unraveling of a man who could not accept the truth. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, two opposing forces clashing in chants. On one side, conservative groups waving signs that read "Marriage built on lies," and "He's the real victim." On the other, LGBTQ activists holding banners declaring trans lives matter and justice for Marissa. The nation was divided, but the investigation had spoken. Jonathan's carefully built life was gone, dismantled piece by piece under the unflinching eye of justice. And as he sat in the interrogation room, head bowed, hands cuffed, Jonathan finally understood the irony. He had spent his career uncovering the most intimate truths of women's bodies. Yet in his own home, in his own marriage, he had been blinded, not by ignorance, but by pride. And that blindness had led him to murder. The trial of Dr. Jonathan Ellison opened on a humid spring morning in Houston, and from the moment jury selection began, it was clear this case would be unlike any other. Satellite trucks lined the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for position while protesters filled the sidewalks. Two camps locked in bitter opposition. On one side, conservative groups held signs reading "Marriage built on lies," and he was deceived. On the other, LGBTQ advocates waved rainbow flags and banners declaring justice for Marissa and trans lives matter. The courthouse buzzed with tension, the air electric with anger and grief. Inside, Jonathan entered in shackles, dressed in a plain suit borrowed from a jail chaplain. Gone was the polished, self-assured physician. His once carefully styled hair was graying at the edges, his face hollow from sleepless nights. Yet when he sat at the defense table, he tried to square his shoulders, clinging to the remnants of his old dignity. The prosecution opened first. District Attorney Vanessa Cruz, a fierce attorney with a reputation for dismantling high-profile defendants, stood before the jury. She didn't mince words. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not about deception. This is not about a secret. This is about murder. Cold, deliberate, and caught on camera." She played the footage from the clinic. Jonathan's hands tightening around Marissa's throat, her body struggling, then going limp. The jury shifted uncomfortably, several members looking away. "You cannot watch this and call it anything other than what it is," Cruz continued. Jonathan Ellison, a man sworn to heal, chose instead to kill. When it was the defense's turn, Attorney Charles Halpern painted a different picture. He portrayed Jonathan as a man betrayed at the deepest level, blindsided by a lie that shattered his identity, his marriage, and his career. This was not a cold-blooded killing, Halpern argued. This was a crime of passion, a snap judgment by a man whose entire life collapsed in a single moment of devastating revelation. He pointed to Jonathan at the table. He is not a monster. He is a husband who was deceived. The nation watched as the trial unfolded, every detail broadcast across networks and dissected by pundits. The courtroom became a stage for broader cultural battles: gender identity, deception in marriage, and the limits of provocation as a defense. Witnesses were called. Friends of Marissa testified that she had lived in fear of losing Jonathan, that she loved him deeply but couldn't bring herself to tell him the full truth about her transition. One of her closest confidants wept on the stand, saying she wanted nothing more than to be accepted as the woman she knew she was. Jonathan was her everything. The medical examiner detailed the bruising, the broken blood vessels, the unmistakable signs of strangulation. There was no medical emergency, she said firmly. This was homicide. Then came Jonathan himself. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on testifying. He walked to the witness stand, his voice trembling at first, then growing steadier as he tried to convince the jury he had been provoked beyond reason. She lied to me, he said. Every day of our marriage felt like a performance. I was humiliated, mocked without even knowing it. Do you understand what that does to a man, to realize that everything he built his life on was crumbling beneath him? He broke down mid-sentence, his hands covering his face. Some jurors looked moved, others stone-faced. On cross-examination, D.A. Cruz pressed hard. Dr. Ellison, you are an OB-GYN. You have devoted your life to the intimate care of women, and yet you want this jury to believe you were fooled, deceived, blindsided? Or is it more likely that your pride couldn't bear the truth? Jonathan's eyes flashed with anger. I was deceived. Don't you dare tell me my feelings weren't real. But your actions were. Cruz fired back. You had a choice, and you chose violence. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Outside, the protest grew louder with each passing day. Pundits on cable news argued late into the night. Was Jonathan a victim of deceit or a killer driven by prejudice? The country split down the middle. Closing arguments sealed the atmosphere. Cruz told the jury, "You saw the tape. You heard the screams. This wasn't a man snapping in the heat of the moment. This was control, sustained pressure, and a decision not to stop until Marissa was dead." Halpern countered, appealing to emotion. Yes, Jonathan acted, but he acted as a man betrayed, humiliated beyond endurance. Is that murder, or is it a tragedy born of lies? After 2 days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the hushed courtroom. Jonathan's hands clenched on the table, knuckles white. The forewoman rose, her voice steady. We find the defendant, Dr. Jonathan Ellison, guilty of murder in the second degree. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Outside, crowds erupted, some cheering, others chanting in anger. Jonathan's shoulders sagged as the weight of the verdict crushed him. He had gambled on the jury's sympathy, but the evidence had been too stark. The perfect life he had once flaunted was gone, replaced by a single word: guilty. As deputies led him away, Jonathan glanced back at the courtroom one last time. On the wall hung a portrait of Lady Justice, blindfolded, scales in hand. For the first time in his life, Jonathan realized she had seen through him all along. The sentencing hearing drew as much attention as the trial itself. The courthouse steps were once again crowded with reporters, activists, and protesters carrying signs. The nation had been riveted for weeks, and now everyone wanted to see how the story of Dr. Jonathan Ellison would end. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the air so heavy it felt like even the chandeliers above sagged under its weight. Jonathan shuffled in wearing his orange prison jumpsuit, wrists cuffed in front of him. The transformation from celebrated physician to convicted murderer was complete, yet he still tried to carry himself with a dignity that had once been second nature. His eyes, however, betrayed him, sunken, restless, haunted. Judge Harold Whitmore presided over the hearing, his expression stern. He began by allowing victim impact statements. A close friend of Marissa's took the stand, clutching a framed photo. Her voice trembled as she described Marissa's dreams of living freely, of one day finishing her transition without fear. She wanted nothing more than to love and be loved. Jonathan took that from her, and in doing so, he silenced a woman who had fought her whole life just to exist. Members of the LGBTQ community spoke as well, their testimonies impassioned. One activist said, "Marissa Rivera is not just another statistic. She is a face, a name, a life cut short because of prejudice and pride. We will not forget her." When it was his turn, Jonathan rose slowly, his chains clinking. His voice cracked as he addressed the court. "I never wanted this. I never meant for Marissa to die. I was blindsided, humiliated, and I reacted in anger. I loved her, I did, but I couldn't live with the lies. I asked this court for mercy." He wiped at his eyes, but his plea sounded hollow in the vast, silent room. Judge Whitmore's gaze never wavered. "Dr. Ellison," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of finality, "you were a man entrusted with preserving life. Instead, you chose to take it, cruelly, deliberately, and without justification. This court has considered the arguments, the evidence, and the pain inflicted. The sentence is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Gasps filled the room. Jonathan's face drained of color. For a man who had always been in control of his career, of his image of the people around him, the reality of dying behind bars shattered him. Deputies pulled him away, his shoulders slumped, the last remnants of his once proud posture gone. The aftermath rippled far beyond Houston. News outlets covered the case relentlessly, sparking debates across dinner tables, universities, and talk shows. Was Jonathan a victim of deceit or a perpetrator of prejudice? Was this a tragedy born of secrets, or a hate crime rooted in entitlement and rage? There were no simple answers, only heated arguments and fractured opinions. But one thing was clear: Marissa's name became a rallying cry. Her story was invoked at marches and vigils, her photo held high by strangers who never knew her but felt the weight of her loss. She became a symbol for the violence faced by transgender women, her death sparking conversations that lawmakers, churches, and communities could no longer ignore. In Houston, a mural was painted in her honor, Marissa's face framed by flowers, the words "she was loved, she was here" written beneath. It became a gathering place for those who wanted to mourn, to protest, or simply to remember. For Jonathan, the legacy was darker. His medical license was stripped, his clinic shuttered, his reputation obliterated. In prison, he was just another inmate, known more for infamy than skill. The man who once delivered life now spent his days among those who had taken it. And yet, in a cruel twist of fate, both names, Jonathan Ellison and Marissa Rivera, remained forever linked. One as the perpetrator of a crime that shocked the nation, the other as its victim, whose story forced the country to confront its deepest prejudices. In the end, the fairy tale that had once seemed perfect unraveled into a cautionary tale, a reminder that secrets, shame, and pride can destroy even the most carefully constructed lives. Jonathan Ellison would die behind prison walls. But Marissa, in death, had found a strange kind of immortality, her voice amplified not by silence, but by the countless others who would carry her story forward. And in that way, she won the kind of legacy Jonathan never could.